It's 5:30. It's delightful to see so many of you here. It's like how things used to be, with a full house for a really stimulating talk. Welcome to Insights, Newcastle University's public lecture programme. I'm Martin Farr, co-chair of the Insights Committee. My great pleasure welcoming you this evening to the latest in our autumn series. A few bits of housekeeping. Could you make sure your phones are in a silent way, please? Not expecting an alarm. Please go outside into the car park if there should be one. The next lecture we have is on the 15th of November and is entitled 3 Tales from the Frontier of Medical Sciences Research. That's our next lecture on the Tuesday the 15th of November. I'll be chairing today's session with enormous pleasure because the speaker is a colleague of mine in the School of History, Classics and Archaeology. He's senior lecturer in Russian history. We had a tantalising glimpse of him in 2010, where he was here for a year, then he returned permanently in 2015. This would embarrass him, an enormously popular teacher. His courses are always massively oversubscribed, and he's been thrust into a perhaps unwelcome limelight by the events of this year. His research interests include the impact of war and violence on Russian society. His first book was Demobilized Veterans in Late Stalinist Leningrad, and his current very large research project concerns the legacy of the Great Patriotic War, as the Eastern Front in the Second World War was called. On the 24th of February, as we'll discover, the Russian government launched its special military operations, as it calls it, in Ukraine. And 2 months later, in April, Rob organised the university's, I think, its first response to that, which was a symposium bringing together colleagues from across the university and other institutions to talk about, try and make sense of what was going on, because it was still so fresh and so hard to process. It was an enormously fulfilling experience, as was just the casual conversations beforehand, moving furniture and so on, about the people that Rob knew in Ukraine and the experiences they were undergoing. And that is one of the sense one had even in April was that there was a danger that the war may fade in the popular mind to become something we're simply used to, an ongoing concern rather than something which should be at the forefront of our minds. And it was striking how some of us have academic impartiality. We could drop that really with the war in Ukraine because it was such an obviously egregious act. It's with us. Arguably, the result of the American midterms this week has been positive for Western support for Ukraine, despite likely Russian interference in the elections. And it's with us, and that's why you're here. It's a compelling subject. We have a compelling speaker, so please would you join me in welcoming Rob Dale.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin, for your kind introduction, and thank you to everybody for coming today. Simply put, this is a war with an immediate past as well as deep historical roots. Although the Russian army's invasion of the 24th of February and the build-up to it shocked the world, this was not the start of the war. This is the 260th day of the invasion. But this war actually began with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the Donbass in the spring of 2014. So this war is in actually its 8th year and has already claimed, even before the 24th of February, had claimed the lives of over 14,000 Ukrainian soldiers before this full-scale invasion. Indeed, long before 2014, there were already deep historical tensions between Ukraine and Russia. These preceded the Soviet collapse in 1991 and even the revolutions of 1917. So this is a war with a long history, but it is also a war about history. History is being distorted not just by memory wars and but also by long established historical myths. In recent years, as we'll see later in my lecture, Vladimir Putin has made a number of historical interventions in long, rambling speeches that invoke, manipulate, and distort history in the grossest of ways. They frequently give me headaches. The war is surrounded by bad history and by the use and abuse of the past. My purpose this evening, then, is to explore how history can help us understand the course and nature of this war, and also how history can counter Russian disinformation, myths, and false narratives. First, though, a few words about terminology. Since the 24th of February, a multitude of terms have circulated in the press and media to describe events. Many of them, I think, are problematic and misleading. So you'll have seen the phrases Ukrainian crisis and Russo-Ukrainian war. I think these are problematic because I'm not sure Ukraine actually is in crisis. It's Russia that's in crisis. And I think the term Russo-Ukrainian war suggests a mutual equivalence in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I prefer the terms Russia's war on Ukraine or Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, I don't think this is just semantics. What we call wars matters. It shapes how they are understood. The words we use to frame Ukrainian history matter. The Soviet Union actually excelled in giving wars their own ideological labels. They called the First World War the Great Imperialist War and the Second World War the Great Patriotic War. And that frames how they are understood. Russia continues to eschew the term war and continues to use the phrase special military operation. Indeed, you will remember that on the 4th of March, the Russian parliament passed legislation that censored the words war and invasion. I prefer this term Russia's war on Ukraine because this is an attack on Ukrainian sovereignty, statehood, identity, and culture. It's not a precise or forensic operation to protect ethnic Russians. Finally, I'm also going to try and avoid the term Putin's war. Although Putin must bear responsibility for this war, and without him I don't think it would have happened, this is not simply the product of one man's obsession. This is very much Russia's war, a conflict waged by Russians and sadly supported by many Russians. At this point, I want to turn to some historical context. For many people in Britain and the West, Ukraine has only begun to figure in their minds and thinking since February. Ukraine, a state of approximately 45.4 million people in 2014, has a landmass of approximately 233,000 square miles. But it's only recently been incorporated into the mental maps of many Europeans. Ukraine is Europe's second largest country, if we count Russia as European. That would be the first. Ukraine is a fraction larger than France, and it's approximately the size of Germany and Britain combined. But it's repeatedly presented as a small and peripheral country. It's not a peripheral place at all. Its history has been central to that of modern Europe. So much of the story of Imperial Russian history and the so-called Soviet century has centered on modern Ukraine. For too long, we have failed to give Ukrainian history its rightful place and position. In 1995, the much-missed historian Mark von Hagen wrote a provocative and prescient article in Slavic Review entitled, "Does Ukraine have a history?" Now, this strikes me as a question that many people not schooled in Ukrainian history have been asking. Now, of course, Ukraine, its people, its institutions, the modern Ukrainian nation state have histories. But the teaching of Ukrainian history and its wider public consciousness is much weaker. Sadly, Mark von Hagen's point that Ukraine has been denied full historical legitimacy still holds. Ukraine is a place where borders have repeatedly moved across people and where people have repeatedly moved across borders. It's a crossing place, subjected to incursions from almost all directions. Here, the categories of nation, state, and ethnicity and religion do not neatly align. Like many states in Central and Eastern Europe, Ukraine has been caught between two more powerful neighbours and hegemonic discourses that implied these nations were not, that Ukraine was not a real nation state, that it was an artificial creation. This flux and complexity in Ukrainian history can be exploited to present Ukraine as politically and economically unstable and not fully deserving independent statehood. This isn't helped by the fact that Ukraine's borders are anything but clear or natural. Indeed, the word Ukraine in Russian literally means borderland. Ukraine, however, has always been more than a peripheral and slightly suspect border space. It's a place rich in resources. Its highly fertile black soil still provides most of the world's wheat. It has immense mineral wealth, especially in the Donbass. Its ports on the Black Sea and on the coast of Azov have a key geopolitical significance. So Ukraine very firmly has its own history, its own distinct identity, its own political culture. And an independent sovereign Ukraine has now existed for over 30 years, having gained independence in 1991. The collapse of the Soviet Union, Europe's last empire, in December 1991 was a moment of world historical significance. And Ukraine's withdrawal from the Soviet Union was a key determinant in the Soviet collapse. On the 1st of December 1991, Ukraine held a national referendum to confirm its independence from the Soviet Union, where on a turnout of, I think, 84%, 92.3% of Ukrainian citizens voted for independence. There was a majority for independence in every province, including Crimea, which at the time had a large Russian ethnic minority. So Ukrainians' withdrawal from the Soviet Union was key in dissolving it. The other Soviet states couldn't imagine a Soviet Union if Ukraine, or a looser form of union, if Ukraine wasn't part of it. The deeper past of Ukrainian history shouldn't overshadow this 30-year history. Perhaps counterintuitively for a historian, I think it's possible to have too much history and too much memory in this instance. 30 years is actually quite a long time. It's longer than the distance between the First and Second World Wars, a period that encompasses many historical subfields. In the last 30 years of Ukraine's history, the last 30 years of Russia's meddling in Ukraine's domestic affairs often gets overlooked by focusing on a deeper Ukrainian past. So although Ukraine has its history, there remains a popular misconception that Ukraine had previously been part of Russia. This reflects a confusion about the constitutional and administrative structures of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and Ukraine's place within it. In British discourse, we often use the words Russian and Soviet interchangeably. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic were just two of 15 Soviet republics. The claim that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, that Putin frequently makes, something that we'll return to later, at the centre of a whole series of distortions, misrepresentations, and falsehoods about the past. If anything, Russia was part of Ukraine, rather than vice versa. Kievan Rus, the first East Slavic state that existed between the 9th and 13th centuries, is claimed as the foundation of modern Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. This statue here sprang up in the centre of Moscow in 2016. It's a monument to the Ukrainian leader, Prince Vladimir the Great. This appropriation of this cultural figure in Moscow shows you how Putin's Russia is exploiting the medieval past. Kievan Rus was a major part of European society for roughly 300 years. Yaroslav the Wise, for example, married off his daughters to the kings of France, Hungary, and Norway. Kievan Rus existed within a European space. Although the irony here is that the people who arrived here were largely Normans or Scandinavians. They travelled down from the Baltic to Kiev. And in this period, I'm not really sure we can talk about this state having an ethnic identity. This is a 19th century imposition. As a result of the invasion of the Mongol Empire, Kievan Rus broke up into various principalities and successor states, the largest of which was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, that took control of much of the western part of the Kievan lands. By the late 16th century, the political and economic nature of this region had changed decisively. Much of it was now controlled by Cossacks. These are freebooting warriors who made their own fiercely independent living in the region. These Cossacks were anarchic. They had a democratic political culture. They frequently refused to submit to authority. And this is best illustrated by this famous 19th century painting by Ilya Repin. It's called "The Zaporizhian Cossacks Write an Insulting Letter to the Sultan." Now, hopefully what you can see from this is this kind of Cossack identity, this Cossack political culture that thumbs its nose at authority. That I would like to draw a direct connection between this kind of anarchic political culture and the strength of Ukrainian memes that poke fun at contemporary Russia and Vladimir Putin. This disregard for authority influences contemporary Ukrainian discourse. In 1654, thanks to the Pereslav Treaty, these central Ukrainian lands controlled by Cossacks became a kind of protectorate of the Russian Tsars. This is often presented in Soviet historiography as a reunification of Ukraine with Russia, but things are a lot more complicated than this. The treaty was very ambiguously worded, but it's around this time that we get the development of the notions of Great Russia, that's Russia as we would understand it, and Little Russia, that's Ukraine. Ukrainian lands and territories continued to be pulled into the Russian Empire, particularly after the Battle of Poltava in 1721, when Peter I proclaimed an empire for the first time. The Russian Empire was gradually able to gain control over the land west of the Dnieper River in the late 18th century as a result of the partition of Poland. Under Tsarist control, Ukrainian political and social institutions were limited. There was a limited space for Ukrainian identity. In 1876, all publications in Ukrainian were banned. Now, some limited Ukrainian expression was allowed after the 1905 revolution, but there wasn't time between 1905 and 1917 for a cohesive Ukrainian national movement to develop. When the revolutions of 1917 struck, what we understand as modern Ukraine today was split between the Habsburg Empire and the Russian Empire. Power changed frequently in this region after 1917 and between 1919. These lands became the centre of the so-called Russian Civil War. There were several wars, and it wasn't just Russians. This was a civil war for Ukrainians too. Ethnic Ukrainians were fighting on both sides of the conflict, as well as in semi-autonomous peasant bands. But by 1922, the Bolshevik regime was able to declare a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and to consider it part of this wider Soviet structure. The 1920s did allow for some limited Ukrainian cultural expression, but by the 1930s, Ukraine experienced successive waves of collectivization, famine, and political violence. The famine of 1932 to 1933, known as the Holodomor, is understood in Ukraine today as a deliberate genocide intended to destroy Ukrainian national identity and culture. During the Second World War, Ukraine became what Timothy Schneider calls the Bloodlands. It was the centre of a savage partisan war. It experienced a period of violence and killing difficult to comprehend, even against the backdrop of contemporary events. Yet, as a result of the turmoil at the end of the Second World War, a redrawing of European boundaries allowed the Soviet Union to create a form of Ukraine that is roughly coterminous with contemporary Ukraine. As I said earlier, Ukraine gained its independence in 1991. The 1990s were very difficult years for Ukraine. It was a period of immense poverty, of economic collapse, of insecurity. These were really hungry years for many Ukrainians. But while these economic forces in Russia developed a kind of support for strongmen, Ukrainian democracy has survived, although perhaps it doesn't entirely thrive. Although economic problems and corruption abound, Ukraine has elected 6 presidents since 1991. It's experienced revolutions in 2004 and 2014. And no one single authoritarian leader has emerged like in Russia or in other post-Soviet states. We now turn to the part of the lecture which I'm least looking forward to. It's where we have to confront Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and his ideas. These are perhaps the high point in Russia's long imperialist attitude towards Ukraine. Putin has made a number of interventions in long, rambling history essays and history-inflected speeches. Putin does not see Ukraine as a legitimate sovereign country. The last 30 years of Ukrainian sovereignty mean nothing to Putin, nor do conventional historical orthodoxies. On the 12th of July 2021, Putin published a nearly 7,000-word history essay entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. This begins, as you can see on the slide, by asserting that Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. As Putin himself notes, it's what I've said on numerous occasions and what I firmly believe. He goes on, first of all, I would like to emphasize that the war that has emerged in recent years between Russia and Ukraine, between the parts of what is essentially the same historical and spiritual space, to mind is our great common misfortune and tragedy. In summary, Putin believes that Ukraine is part of Russia, or it's a region of Greater Russia. This essay offers a long and not particularly good historical justification for this thesis. He begins by asserting that Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus, which was the largest state of Europe and according to Putin was bound together by one language. His essay roams across the fracturing of space into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the ways in which Ukrainian lands were incorporated into the Russian Empire, Ukraine's brief independence in 1917, and its reintegration into the Soviet Union. Critically, Putin sees modern Ukraine as entirely the product of the Soviet era. He sees it as a kind of a mistake, that it was formed in the way it does. After that point in this essay, things take a darker rhetorical turn. He begins to complain about the Ukrainian political elite, about the Maidan revolution of 2013-14, and the increasing assertiveness of Ukrainian radicals and neo-Nazis. He starts to complain about the ways in which Ukrainians have, quote, begun to mythologize and write history, edit out everything that united us, and refer to the period when Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union as an occupation. The common tragedy of collectivization and famine of the 1930s was portrayed as a genocide of the Ukrainian peoples. Now, history is being used and abused here at the most mendacious levels. It's absolutely true that Ukraine has been going through its own period of historical re-evaluation and rewriting, and that the position of nationalists and Nazi collaborators like Stepan Bandera have been re-evaluated, especially in Western Ukraine. But Putin seems to be absolutely ignorant that he is rewriting history too. And that's what happens in history. We turn up every day and we rewrite history. We rework, we rethink, we reinterpret history. To deny the ways in which Ukrainian culture and expression and national sentiment was repressed in the 19th and 20th century flies in the face of masses of historical evidence. Although we can argue about whether the famine of 1932-33 constituted a genocide in its strictest legal definitions, denying that this was a genocide also serves to deny the central historical trauma upon which modern Ukrainian national identity is built, both in Ukraine and in the Ukrainian diaspora. The rhetoric of the historical unity of Russia and Ukraine was repeated in Putin's address on the 21st of February 2022. He ramped up this rhetoric, continuing to talk about how Russian and Ukrainian populations were almost a common entity. Putin was trying to explain how he saw contemporary Ukraine as an illegitimate creation. He noted in this speech that, quote, nobody asked the millions of people living there what they thought, which seemed rather paradoxical given he was about to launch an invasion 3 days later. All of these interventions by Putin are bad history, not just in the ways in which they elide the complexity of the Ukrainian past, but the ways in which they weaponize history for Putin's political project. What is going on here is a historical justification for Russian imperialism. Now here, again, I think we might have too much history. Putin's interventions in history are an intellectual veneer for something much more serious. So rather than trying to tie ourselves up in knots deconstructing Putin's bad takes, the question we should be asking is how any of this history, even if it bears any resemblance to reality, how any of this justifies Russia's actions. How could this history justify the actions of the Russian military in Irpin, Luhansk, Donetsk, Mariupol, Kherson, or the shelling of Kyiv, Kharkiv, or other cities? Rather than just accepting or reporting Putin's version of the world, we might ask about the considerable gap between his words and deeds, between image and reality. Soviet historians, after all, are supposed to be good and skilled at reading against the grain, between the lines, in order to see the actions of the Soviet party state. So we should apply those same skills here. When Putin wrote on the 21st of July, quote, we respect the Ukrainian language and traditions. We respect Ukrainians' desire to see their country free, safe, and prosperous. We might ask whether that actually happened. When he declared in his declaration, when he said in his declaration of war on the 24th of February that today's events are not connected with the desire to infringe on the interests of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, that they are connected with the protection of Russia itself from those who took Ukraine hostage and are trying to use it against our country and its people, we might ask if that is what is happening. Putin bandies this word genocide around, but the actions of the Russian military suggest something more sinister again. Russia has waged a war and an attack not just on the Ukrainian military, but on Ukrainian identity and culture. So Ukrainian cultural monuments, such as the Holocaust Memorial at Babi Yar, the central Ukrainian site of the Holocaust, were shelled on the 1st of March. And on the 26th of March, you can see on the right on my slide here, the Holocaust Memorial at Dobritsky Yar, outside of Kharkiv, where 15,000 Jews were murdered in 1941 and 1942, was also shelled. So, regardless of what Putin claims to be doing, the result has been atrocity, murder, and attacks on Ukrainian culture, language, and identity. Now, whether this constitutes enough to meet the legal threshold for genocide will be contested, but I completely understand why Ukrainians consider that a genocidal conflict is being waged against them. Okay. One of the ways in which this conflict is being reported and understood at the moment is approaching it through the perspective of leaders. We call this Vladimir Putin's war, for example. And this wouldn't have happened without Vladimir Putin. But politicians, journalists, and public figures of various hues have made public statements that support or justify war, and often go as far to advocate the elimination of Ukrainians. Now, public opinion would be very different if Putin was suddenly removed from office. But we shouldn't delude ourselves that there aren't significant sections of the Russian population who object to Ukraine. There's a risk that if we concentrate too much on the leaders, we obscure a wider understanding of war. One of the things that social and cultural historians of Stalinism will tell you is that you can't understand Soviet history just from the perspective of Stalin in the Kremlin. History is always more complicated than that. Press discussions about whether Putin has gone mad in his bunker during COVID, or whether he's suffering from cancer or Parkinson's, reflect an older way of doing Kremlinology. But they also divert us from understanding that the attacks and atrocities are also the actions of many people beyond Putin. Furthermore, we should understand that Ukrainian resistance is much more than any inspirational leadership coming from Vladimir Zelensky. Now, clearly we need to take Putin seriously, we need to take his public statements seriously, but we know what we're dealing with Putin. We know we're dealing with a kleptocrat, a corrupt politician, somebody who harbours imperialist ambitions. We're not really going to understand this war and its nature until we move beyond discussions of the plans and intentions of leaders, generals, and political elites. We're not going to understand it until we start thinking about war's victims. We won't really fully understand it until we've fully documented the stories of millions of women and children internally and externally displaced by war. Until we understand the stories of civilians sheltering in basements and bomb shelters. Until we reveal the stories and lives of people unceremoniously dumped in mass graves. That's the future work for historians and legal scholars as well. So it's particularly unpleasant against that backdrop for me that this Soviet notion of the so-called friendship of the peoples is continually evoked in contemporary Russian thinking. There was a Stalinist notion that the Soviet Union was a harmonious society of nations where everybody, despite their ethnic identity, loved the great leader, and they loved the great leader in kind of unity. All of these particular people on the slide on the right are representatives of a different Soviet republic, and they have salutations to the great Stalin in all of the languages of the Soviet Union on the right. This notion of the harmony of Soviet peoples was a central Soviet idea, and surprisingly a central Soviet idea that has proved remarkably durable in contemporary Russia. Relations between national and ethnic groups were never this harmonious, and they're not that harmonious now in contemporary Russia. We've seen some of those ethnic tensions in the way in which different ethnic groups have experienced the burden of Russia's mobilization in different ways. Okay. History can also help us understand the war in Ukraine in other ways, especially by looking at how Russia's politics and society thinks about war and conflict. Russia's sacralization of the so-called Great Patriotic War presents multiple historical problems for contemporary Russia. Now, Russian historical memory has this notion of a kind of victory cult. The idea that the Second World War for the Soviet Union was its it's a new foundational moment. Russia tells itself a story of glory, heroism, and victory. Around the 9th of May every year on Victory Day, this word "Pobieda," victory, is ubiquitous. It was ubiquitous in the Soviet Union. There was a brand of watches called Pobieda. Collective farms were named Pobieda in their droves. There was even a saloon car called the Pobieda. And this word victory, Pobieda, is ubiquitous in contemporary Russia. But it results in contemporary Russia telling a story that avoids difficult and contentious subjects. It avoids the difficult, uncomfortable things that Russia experienced. It avoids telling the story of the enormous indifference and callousness towards human life in the Red Army during the Second World War. It avoids talking about the fate of disabled veterans or orphan children or prisoners of war. It doesn't talk about, these are the kind of pictures you get when Russia thinks about the Second World War. It doesn't talk about the mass rape of women in Germany, Austria, Hungary, Romania, or Bulgaria. It doesn't talk about the mass looting that the Red Army conducted in Eastern Europe. Now, trying to evaluate this history is quite difficult in contemporary Russia. It's very problematic for Russian historians and Western historians of Russia too. On the 15th of May 2009, under Dmitry Medvedev's presidency, a presidential commission of the Russian Federation to counter attempts to falsify history to the detriment of Russia's interests was established. This only lasted until 2012, but its effects were chilling. It stopped historians probing into all sorts of errors. It resulted in various archival collections being closed. On the 5th of May 2014, the so-called memory law was passed, and this has effectively criminalized the expression of certain opinions about the Soviet past. It can impose harsh fines on people who break this law, but it can also mandate prison sentences and up to 3-year forced labor terms. And it has been used. Okay, so actually coming to terms with this experience of the Second World War has been very difficult, but it's also created serious problems. Russia's failures to evaluate the atrocities committed by Soviet soldiers in the Second World War has made these things more likely in the present. When Russia claims that it's waging a war against Nazis, right-wing elements and Satanists in Ukraine today, in the interests of protecting ethnic Russians, it's in effect making any form of military conduct acceptable. The atrocities in Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, and the Kharkiv region and so many other places need to be discussed. We need to understand what has been happening in these places, and Russia will have to come to terms both with the Second World War history and also the actions of its soldiers today. The failure to appreciate the true nature of warfare by obscuring it with patriotic narratives of glory and heroism has made it easier for the Russian military to behave in these ways again. Okay, there's one, here is just an image here of a Red Army soldier trying to steal a bicycle off a woman in Berlin in 1945. This kind of outright looting that we see today of the Russian military was legalized in the Red Army in the Second World War. Red Army soldiers had a monthly postal allowance, a certain postage weight of looted property they were allowed to send home. Okay, there's one other contemporary Russian myth that I want to dismantle, which underpins a lot of thinking about the current war effort, and that's the strength of the Russian military. This is what these photographs from Victory Day parades are. That's their function in my talk here, to kind of show you the image of Russia's military that it wants to project. Each year, Russia gets a free pass on the international stage to demonstrate its military might. Each year, these images of Russian military precision and discipline are beamed into people's front rooms in Russia and the rest of the world. New weapons are unveiled, neatly drilled soldiers parade through Russian cities. Now, these military rituals are very carefully choreographed so that they can be photographed in these ways and televised. But we sometimes forget how much choreography is going on here. The soldiers who perform in these parades spend weeks training for this. In fact, by my calculations, soldiers spend longer rehearsing for Red Square parades than recent conscripts have spent in basic training before they are sent to the front lines. These kind of images do not reflect the reality of the Russian military. Russian military performance since the Soviet war in Afghanistan has left much to be desired. Despite months of build-up on the Ukrainian border, the Russian military was not prepared for anything beyond the short 3-day blitzkrieg that they had convinced themselves was all that was necessary for a Ukrainian collapse. The stories of Russian military failure are legion. Russian tank crews appear to have been supplied with Soviet atlases from 1963 and 1964. Russian soldiers in some units, as you can see this here, in some units Russian soldiers were being provided with ration packs that went out of date in February 2015, 7 years out of date. No wonder then that Russian soldiers looted shops. They're caught here on a Ukrainian security camera. At the start of the war, so-called contract soldiers, professional soldiers, were the only soldiers that were supposed to be allowed to serve beyond Russian borders. But there are plenty of stories of Russian conscripts being forced to serve in Ukraine, sometimes under physical duress. The professionalization of the Russian army, a 20-year project, has been a failure. So much looting has occurred, particularly of washing machines. There's an amazing number of Russian soldiers stealing washing machines. That in Czechoslovakia, in the Czech Republic, this monument to a Red Army soldier from the Second World War has had its plinth repainted so that it is a washing machine. So we have seen multiple military failures. Soldiers, recruits having to buy their own bedrolls and sleeping bags. You may have seen a viral video where Russian soldiers were instructed to buy their own medical supplies, particularly tampons, because these apparently are very useful to plug into bullet holes to stop bleeding. Russia is not prepared. Its military is no way nearly as strong as we sometimes fear. The idea that the Russian army is a pillar of society and an institution capable of drafting the Russian nation, an integrating force within Russian society, is a massive myth. While Russian society may celebrate the heroism of the Red Army in the Second World War, there are very good reasons why declining numbers of young men are attracted by military careers. Conditions and culture in the army have been abysmal for decades. The so-called practice of dedovshchina has been particularly detrimental to Russian military effectiveness. Now, this term dedovshchina literally translates as kind of rule of the granddads. It's a form of seniority-based hazing, where the older recruits beat up the younger recruits, almost as a rite of passage. In fact, the Human Rights Watch report into this in 2004 called it the wrongs of passage. And once you move through the military and you become a more senior soldier, you get to beat up the younger recruits. That's your payoff. This has been a massive problem for Russia since around 1987, 1988. It was a massive problem in Chechnya, and this has acquired an ethnic dimension now. Now, I've tried to obscure people's faces so you can't tell who anyone is here. But this is an example of a senior soldier humiliating his younger recruits by writing Dagestan on their heads. This is quite distressing in some ways, but I wanted to show you that there are reasons why Russia's military effectiveness has been impaired. This kind of bullying with its ethnic dimensions really does destroy any notion of the friendship of the peoples. Okay. So this violence of military life, the evils of dedovshchina, are well known in Russia. In fact, one of the things that made the much-missed murdered journalist Anna Politkovskaya famous was her exposés of the ways in which soldiers were being hazed in the military. My wider point here then is that there is a very good historically grounded reason why the Russian military lacks combat motivation. One of the reasons why Ukrainian forces have held up and have been able to push back the Russian army is that they actually have something to fight for. The Russian army's attempt for an even partial mobilization without paying any attention to morale was foolish, although I don't mind that. The weapons, military training, supplies, logistical and intelligence support that Ukraine has been supplied with by the West is making a difference. But critically, Ukraine has the advantage of having a cause that is genuinely supported by the mass of the population. The Ukrainian Citizen Army and Volunteer Defence Force are fighting because they have to, and because they believe in Ukrainian sovereignty. In contrast, since the mid-1990s, Russia has seen its citizen-soldier model collapse. Okay, in conclusion, I have a few general points to pull out here. Language and literature are vital for understanding Ukrainian society, culture, and identity. Politics, international relations, and security studies have an important role in helping us understand the current process of the conflict and its international implications. However, I think it's history that best explains Russia's actions, Ukraine's response, and I think should guide our thinking about the war. History can contextualize this conflict, but it can also make us think differently about it, helping us avoid Russian propaganda. It can help us appreciate the distinctions between Russian and Ukrainian historical experiences and national identities, and to avoid imperialist narratives that suggest Russia and Ukraine are essentially the same space inhabited by the same people. History skills can help us dissect the statements of Russian political leaders and to assess whether their putative concerns are matched by their actions. History can offers us harder to say than I thought. History offers us solutions and approaches to understanding what has happened. But also bad history is part of the problem. The use and abuse of the memory of the Second World War in contemporary Russia, for example, has in large part created the conditions in which such a war could be waged. So as well as a military problem, Russia has a problem with its history. And I'll leave it there.